This is a podcast for Functional Ecology at British Ecological Society publication.
Hello, today I'm really excited to have Phoebe Griffith with me. She is from the Institute of Zoology and the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford. Today we're going to be talking about her paper, using functional traits to identify conservation priorities for the world's crocodilians. This paper is due to feature in one of our animal functional traits special focus issues. So hello Phoebe, it's great to have you here.
Hi, fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
So I'd just like to ask you, as we always do on these podcasts, to tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from? What are your research interests? How did you get into ecology? And then how did you come to study crocodiles?
Yeah, so I've always had a huge interest in wildlife. Particularly, I grew up in Nepal, and so I was very lucky to see the sort of incredible diversity of wildlife that was in the country. So that led to me studying biology, and then my particular interest is conservation because kind of inevitably when looking around at the species I was interested in, I found that most of the ones that I was fascinated by, such as crocodilians and other freshwater megafauna species, most of them weren't doing terribly well. So I worked a little bit in conservation with a bit of research, and then started this project I currently work on, which is working with our partners in the Nepal government, looking at the conservation of a species called the gharial in Nepal, which is a very, very weird looking crocodilian. And yeah, we kind of started this project because the Nepal government has been running a conservation program on gharial for a number of years, since the late 70s, but the population still remains critically endangered. So there was a need for a kind of science-focused approach to try and understand the reasons behind that. So that was how I sort of first got involved with crocodilians. I've never looked back. And then having started looking at a single species, that's what got me really interested in more of a kind of comparative approach, asking why is this species so critically endangered when other crocodilian populations have completely recovered from being endangered in the past. And looking at this group of species, we have this huge variations in extinction risk and conservation status. So that then got me asking some of the kind of bigger questions in ecology and conservation.
So I'd just like to ask about the gharial in particular, because that's what started off this journey for you. So you talked about it being critically endangered. Can you tell the listeners what has led to this? Is this anthropogenic? How has this been caused?
Yeah, so essentially what kind of happened in the kind of 50s and 60s internationally was most crocodilian populations started being really, really, really heavily hunted for their skins. And this was in a world that was post-World War II. There were a lot of men coming back from fighting who knew how to use firearms, who had access to these new developments in technology like motorboats and 4x4s, who had these, so a crocodile's protection is they're incredibly cryptic. They're very difficult to see. And all that is undermined the second you get a powerful electric torch, because if you shine that in a wetland, they have this very reflective layer at the back of their eyes, which helps them see in the dark. But it means that their eyes just shine, kind of like cat's eyes. And then it's very easy to see where their head is and kill them. So most crocodilians around the world had their populations really, really heavily hunted. And at the same time, and kind of quite difficult in hindsight to disentangle from this hunting was the sudden big development projects going on that were damming rivers, moving rivers, doing larger scale fishing in rivers. And so there was suddenly all these habitat modifications and impacts. And so croc populations worldwide just collapsed. And with a lot of the hunted species, then legal trade, which is still in place, came in. And so crocs now are mostly, their skin is collected legally. And so there's no or very little pressure on them in the wild for an illegal trade. So most of those populations that got hunted recovered. The gharial didn't. And it seems that it was because it wasn't the hunting that had really impacted it. It was these other river modifications. So in particular, one of the, I guess, the two big things that correlate with the disappearance of gharial and their inability to recover in the 50 years since has been this building of dams and barrages that are fragmenting the rivers they live in, and the development of these destructive fishing methods, like using gill nets, which are synthetic nets made from synthetic fibers that entangle and drown a whole range of different freshwater species, including gharial.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. And one thing I wanted to ask is just about, because we're going to be talking about the diversity and functional traits of crocodiles. So, they're very, I mean, this seems quite churlish to say, but they're quite old. But the diversity isn't as sort of prominent as you would see in something like birds or other sort of very long-living sort of species that we associate with the dinosaurs. Can you dig into that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so it's because we are at a snapshot in time right now where there are very few croc species. There's probably around 28 at the moment. That number's changing as people look at the genetics and find that what they thought were a single species were actually populations that have diverged millions of years ago. But they look quite similar, and that's because what we are left with today is sort of a remnant of the historical croc biodiversity. So even just a few million years ago, you have everything from the kind of crocodiles we have today, but in the past there have been marine or completely marine crocodiles, arboreal crocodiles, so crocodiles that can climb trees.
Wow.
Potentially right up until a few thousand years ago, you have species that would be fully terrestrial and would run down their prey. And if you go far enough back, you have herbivorous ones as well. So there has been this huge diversity in the past, and then generally sort of looking at the kind of history of crocodilian forms, in warmer periods of history we get a big diversity, and then in the cooler periods like the ice age that the world has just come out of, you get this cutting down and you suddenly have the crocodiles retreating back to this perfect design of these amphibious predators that is the kind of the form that there's always crocs like that. There's no other species that's kind of nailed this amphibious predator niche like crocodilians have. So in a time like today, where we're at a low diversity in kind of evolutionary time, we're ending up with just this kind of one basic type. But then what we were looking at in our study was actually people think of crocodiles or alligators as all being quite similar, but they're actually startlingly different, just because they look quite similar to the human eye, but their behaviors are hugely different. So the Chinese alligator, for example, is a tiny little species, mostly eats, mollusks and so like snails and other hard-shelled organisms and crustaceans, and it digs these massive burrows that it lives in and can cope with very cold temperatures. At the complete opposite end of the scale, you've got a 6+ meter saltwater crocodile that makes transoceanic journeys of hundreds of kilometers and can take down a cow if it's a fully grown adult. So, and is very saltwater tolerant, whereas the Chinese alligator today is only found in freshwater climate habitats. So, they don't have the historical diversity we used to see, but they're still pretty diverse.
Yeah, fantastic. Right. So just before we talk about the paper, I'd just like to ask if you have any advice for any young budding ecologists, any sort of tips and tricks of the trade.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think, it's been said a million times, but really focus on doing what you love. I think my realization of that was I was doing a very interesting project in Panama for my undergrad, looking at entomology, and kept getting distracted because every time there was any sort of crocodilian at the field site, I found I could sit for 8 hours trying to watch what the crocodilian was doing, and there was 8 hours behind on what I was supposed to be doing. And so I wasn't really getting very far with my sort of entomology career, but it made me realize that actually a lot of ecology is spending a lot of time on a single thing, and if you don't love that, you could get very bored. So finding the thing that you kind of don't have a boredom threshold for is really important. And I guess the other thing is always just asking people. People are great,
Hmm.
especially in ecology and conservation. Almost every collaboration project thing I've done has just been kind of getting in touch with someone completely cold, just like finding them. Like, I read your paper; it was great. I wondered if you had any opportunities, or you wanted to help me design this part of my project. Um, and yeah, just asking everyone. People don't reply. Some people do reply, and yeah, I think there's no need to kind of hesitate with just getting in touch and asking for help.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, casting a wide net, always good, um,
Yeah.
except for when fishing in crocodile waters, I presume.
Yes, that's always true.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because I think something that's always said about ecologists is that most of them came from really enjoying bird watching. So the fact that you got to grow up in this environment where you got to observe gharials and be in a really beautiful sort of ecosystem and environment is it's wonderful that you've sort of taken that initial sort of childlike wonder at it and followed through right through in your career. So just before we start with the next question, I'm very excited to say that Phoebe has brought some sound recordings for us. So perhaps you could just introduce what they are. Don't give it away too early. Let's see if the listeners can work it out first, and then we'll do a little explanation of what they are afterwards.
Yeah, so these are two recordings that have very kindly been shared with me of two vastly different crocodilians, but two of the species that got flagged in our analysis as being particularly unusual, having quite unusual ecological roles compared to other crocodilians. And yeah, this is two different crocodilians flirting, essentially.
Wonderful. We'll play that for the listeners now. So Phoebe, can you reveal what we were listening to and explain what's going on?
Absolutely. So the first recording was an adult male gharial, and that was recorded by Jailab Dean from the Gharial Ecology Project in the wild in India. And the gharial has this very unusual growth on the end of the snout of adult males. So as they start to mature, this growth called the gara, that's what they're named after, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And males who have this are able to make that sort of percussive noise that was at the start of the recording that's called a pop. And Jai's been studying this and found that the pop is used for a variety of things, from talking to their babies, their fantastic parents, to threatening other males, to what we heard just then, which was flirting with females. So those are the noises that he makes as part of his courtship routine. So while that kind of, he pops up next to the female and makes that popping noise, and then those kind of longer hissing, growling sounds he does while doing sort of water dance to try and impress her. And generally the males spend a lot of time doing this, and they spend a lot of time getting ignored. And then very, very occasionally a female will be won over by this routine, or the 19th time she's seen this routine, which is, yeah, absolutely amazing to see. And then the second recording, that kind of really deep dinosaur almost sounding noise, was from Stefan Rebar with some of the alligators from his lab. He has a number of alligators that they do work with to understand their intelligence and communication. This is alligators, the kind of famous noise they make. This is a bellow. So the bellows are these really, really deep noises. A lot of it can't be heard by the human ear. And in fact, the frequency is so low that they create these kind of Faraday waves, which means the water dances on the male's back, which is really cool. So yeah, alligators bellow, so do other crocodiles. In fact, most crocodiles are really chatty. They spend a lot of time communicating with each other, particularly for courtship. And both males and females make these kind of hissing and bellowing noises, and people are only just starting to understand exactly what these mean by eavesdropping on them.
Wow, fantastic! Yeah, I think it's something that most people probably, I certainly didn't know just how vocal they can be. So I just wanted to ask. I mean, this is putting you on the spot here, but with the dances and with the sounds, do we know as of yet what could potentially separate the wheat from the chaff? What makes a good dance? What makes a good sound? What is there a kind of
Yeah, so there
scale?
was so Stefan, who shared the alligator recording with me. They did a pretty fun study in which they were looking at how size of the alligators related to the sounds they could make. So bigger um, bigger alligators being able to make a sort of deeper noise, and therefore it's kind of an honest signal to the females of being like, I'm the biggest, I'm the best, mate with me. And so they gave them helium, so that suddenly these bigger alligators were making a much higher noise. And so that was a way of, it seems like these could be ways of particularly demonstrating to the females that these are big males. They've got to this big adult size, which means they probably have good genes, but also that they're going to be kind of good at holding their territory, potentially good parents. So particularly for gharial, again, these bigger males that develop these bigger garas can make these louder pop sounds. And this is particularly important for gharial because the males play a really, really key role in parenting. And so a big male is going to look after all the females' babies and do a really good job of it. There is nothing. I mean, a big male gharial is 6 meters. There is nothing that is going to threaten an individual of that size. So by picking the biggest, best male, the female has probably got a better chance of her hatchling surviving. So that's, some of the kind of ideas going around at the moment, but it's still an area that needs more research.
Yeah, fascinating. Right. Well, we'll get on to the paper now. So I'd just like to ask, can you, in sort of plainish terms, explain the novelty of your paper? What does it contribute to our understanding of crocodilian functional traits, and how does it sort of advance our understanding of how to conserve these species?
Yeah, so crocodilians are pretty hard to study in the wild. They're hard to find. They're very cryptic. They spend a lot of time under the water, and a lot of species can be, if you're unlucky, they can be quite dangerous. And so one of the techniques developed primarily initially by botanists was to use, although plants generally not quite so dangerous, but it's to use a functional trait approach. So these are measurable traits. If in the case of crocodiles, these were things like male maximum size, female size, reproductive parameters, a measure of skull shape, a measure of the different types of habitats they use, how they can move over land. And so by collecting all these traits for every individual crocodile species, we can put them together and kind of estimate the ecological role of each species. So, a species that can't travel overland and has a really long, thin skull, and is only found in very specific aquatic habitats, is going to have quite a different ecological role to a species that spends half its life on the rainforest floor, can be found anywhere, and has this little short, stubby skull, more capable of kind of a generalist diet. So by doing this, we were then able to sort of quantify the differences between species' ecological roles and their similarities. So we could find these kind of clusters of functionally similar species, not necessarily closely related ones, but ones that were likely to be performing the same ecological role in their environment, even if they were found kind of on different continents. And also to be able to highlight those species which were completely unique, that, there's nothing else quite like them. So in particular, the number one was the gharial. There's kind of no other croc species that's popping at females and having these kind of massive communal crashes and going to a massive size whilst only pretty much eating fish and other aquatic prey. And so this enabled us to kind of quantify these groupings and differences, and therefore this could be useful for informing how we're studying them, trying to understand these roles, but also how we're trying to conserve them. And as part of that, we highlighted the most unusual species that are also at a really, really high risk of extinction and being lost as those kind of really irreplaceable species, whereas if we let them go extinct in the wild, there's going to be just nothing left like them on Earth today.
Yeah, wonderful. So just to follow up with that, in the paper you identify key species for conservation action, as well as discussing how complementary those selections are with other types of conservation prioritization. How does that translate to on-the-ground recommendations for conservation?
Yeah, so kind of one of the big questions inevitably in conservation is there's always limited resources. So how do we prioritize which species, funders or organizations are gonna focus on, because we can't focus on everything. And so we had flagged these kind of really functionally distinctive species, and we wanted to ask, well, how does this tally up with the other ways people have been prioritizing species? Is this are we wasting our time looking at all these different aspects when we could kind of just use one quick and easy measure and go for that instead? And so the one we're particularly interested in was the phylogenetic diversity, so the diversity of the tree of life, and a measure called EDGE, which is looking at the evolutionary distinctive and globally endangered species. So species that represent a whole branch on the tree of life, often represented by just one or two species that's threatened, at risk of being lost. And what we found that was pretty interesting was that a lot of these species that are very evolutionary distinctive, they're kind of weird, have no close living species as relatives, were the same ones that were having these really unique functional roles in the environment. So we found there was a lot of complementarity, and so these schemes already in place, like the EDGE program, which are focusing on conserving these very unusual species from an evolutionary perspective, we're also doing a pretty good job at capturing a lot of those species that are likely to have an irreplaceable functional role. We didn't find, however, that this was always the case. We kind of found that the other end of the spectrum, we had a lot of these functionally unique species were ones that had a lot of close living relatives and had this kind of speciation in recent years. So particularly the true crocodiles is the big group of what you kind of think of when you think of a crocodile. They only diversified around 10 million years ago, and yet they're on every sort of tropical continent of the world. And so we found that a lot of them were really unique, and that seems to have been being driven by this kind of recent evolution, pushing species to kind of evolve more quickly. And so in terms of kind of practical recommendations, this saying that when you are able to measure the functional diversity, that's a really useful measure. But where it's not possible, for example, in a lot of freshwater species or ones where there's too many, that the looking at the tree of life is a pretty good proxy measure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. So the last part of this question I wanted to ask was that you and your team identified Asia as a hotspot of threatened croc species. I know we've spoken already about the sort of dam and river sort of manipulation as being one of the key issues there. But based on this information, what can be done to facilitate conservation of wetland and river ecosystems in Asia to protect crocs? Is it about relocation? Is it how do we do this once we've actually changed the actual landscape itself through these damming projects?
Yeah, so it's it's kind of all populations of crocodilians in Asia are threatened in some way, and because of these sort of huge impacts on rivers, almost everything, if you think about so much of human society worldwide, a lot of it focuses on rivers, so they tend to be the most impacted part of the system. And especially when you've got a lot of fast development happening, you can end up with huge amounts of pollution, overexploitation, removal of species. And the thing about rivers is it's a connected system. What happens upstream is going to impact what happens downstream. So I think, all over the world, but especially in Asia, it's thinking about the river ecosystem as a whole as something to be conserved for the sake of biodiversity, for the sake of human health, because these rivers are so important often to river-dependent communities who can often be marginalized and not necessarily considered by large-scale infrastructure decisions being made at the international level. So it's thinking about the river as a living thing that we want to conserve for biodiversity, for people, and not just as a source of hydroelectric power, irrigation. And I think that there's going to have to be a big shift to focusing on conserving the kind of whole river system, and all the different parts that make up that ecosystem. We don't know what impact it's going to have if there are no more crocodiles or large fishes or river dolphins in rivers, but it's likely going to be negative for the functioning of the river or the wetland system. And I think particularly with climate change and with unpredictability of weather, natural kind of nature-based solutions to managing flood risk and these kind of things, such as by wetland restoration, are going to be really important. And inevitably, if that's happening in Asia, if we want to do wetland restoration and restore the historical species, that's probably going to involve reintroduction of crocodiles because they're gone from most places that they used to be found in, which is an exciting opportunity at the same time as being a big challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. So, I kind of wanted to talk about the germination of the idea of your article and why you felt compelled to share this with the ecological community, but I feel like we might have covered that already. So perhaps if there's anything else you want to say on it, do let me know. Is there anything else that you feel you want to talk about on that?
I guess just in terms of sort of how it initially came about was sort of working in Nepal. You've got these two, the gharial I've spoken really at length about, but you've also got the mugger crocodile, and these live in the same environments as the gharial. And so we're there doing our project on gharial, and at the same time we're seeing, without that much directed conservation, the mugger populations are recovering really well. They're nesting everywhere. And I was very curious as to what exactly was going on. And so that was kind of one of the first things that's got us thinking about it and thinking about the differences between species. Because things like people be like, yeah, we found some mugger footprints in the middle of the jungle in the dry season, miles from the nearest water body. Or one of the wardens said, yeah, we see the muggers, coming up and walking up the highway and then getting back in the river further up, whereas gharial can't really get out the water very well. They can't walk like other crocodiles. And so, this kind of was what made me start thinking about how these species are actually really, really different. And then, it snowballed into every species.
Well, yeah, it's a wonderful article. And just before I move on to one of the last questions, I'd like to point out the Edge of Existence blog post that I think you and your co-author Ricky Gums authored. It's got a great title, Crying Crocodile Tears, The Disappearing Diversity of Crocodilians and Their Ecological Roles. I found it to be a fascinating, wonderful resource for learning about your research, and it's got some amazing pictures of all the different crocodiles that you couldn't even dream of sort of thinking about or conceiving, the shape of them and their sort of body types and the size. It's remarkable. So I will leave a link to that in the description of this podcast so that people can check that out as well. So one of the final questions I'd like to ask you is, where do you think the research should be directed towards? Where should it be moving towards next?
Yeah, so I think from our paper, there's kind of two main recommendations for moving forward. The first is a much more ecological one, and that's saying that these crocodiles seem to have these very diverse ecological roles, and really calling for more research into this. So trying to understand how is it that crocodilians, as these huge predators in these systems, how are they involved in ecosystem engineering or nutrient management or any of these sort of different processes. These have been investigated quite well in terrestrial apex predators like wolves, or even marine ones like with orcas, but crocs haven't had that level of field research. So that's a really exciting and challenging ecological question. And then the other side is the more applied conservation one, and it's saying, this is urgent. These species are disappearing, and many of them are gone from most of their former range. They're not totally extinct, but they're not doing these ecological roles in 98, 99% sometimes of their former range. And so calling for more conservation action and more sort of applied research to understand what interventions do and don't work, and then sharing this open access with everyone, so everyone can kind of pull together for croc conservation.
Wonderful. And in Nepal, where you were studying the gharials, can you see action happening on the ground at that point? Has the ball started rolling, or?
Absolutely. So the Nepal government and the Chitwan National Park set up a conservation program way back in the 1970s. So real kind of trailblazing conservation work particularly focusing on a reptile. So not necessarily the kind of charismatic species like a rhino or tiger that usually takes center stage. And the wonderful thing we found with the research that my team and myself have been doing, this kind of the science and ecology to underlie and understand why some of these conservation interventions don't work. Everyone has been really interested. The NGOs working there, the national park staff, we share all our data and results with them, and they're immediately thinking, okay, well, how can we change this to improve it? We said, we think you need to release gharial further upstream. That would have a better chance of them surviving their first monsoon, and so that was tried this year. So not only that, but we like to share things like the audio recording I played you earlier and videos of the fantastic parental care that gharial do, and we share these with interest groups from the local community because these are their gharial, they're living in their rivers, and it's just wonderful to see some of these community-based forest groups are setting up their own gharial conservation work, or asking us, what research were you thinking of doing next? And we've told them, and they said, we want to lead on that instead, which is incredible. And obviously it's like, yeah, absolutely, this is your river, this is what we've learned, run with it. Entirely positive, which has been incredibly uplifting.
Yeah, amazing news. So I don't want to bring it down too much, but I'd like you to. Nobody likes it when I ask them to do this, which is probably why I keep asking them to do it. I'd like you to get your crystal ball out for me and describe a future, or what the future looks like at present for crocodiles. So one thing that I wanted to know about is, crocs throughout history have rediversified. They've bounced back from 2 past mass extinctions. Is there anything unique about the Anthropocene that might mean their characteristic resilience might not suffice? It might not be enough.
I think that we've got a what's going on in the Anthropocene and the impacts of humans creating current mass extinction is just so different from anything we've seen historically. To kind of compare to the most recent previous mass extinction, the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, and crocs had no problem with, they just sailed through that. A big part of that is their river species, and kind of river systems are generally driven a lot by detritus, and when the world is ending around a river and all that dead matter is ending up in a river, actually the river is the best place to be. They, in a way, those rivers potentially were some kind of sort of refugia, a place where crocodilians that were found in rivers were safe. Most croc species are prolific burrow diggers as well, so they also dig these massive burrows. I think the biggest burrows currently dug in the animal kingdom are dug by crocodiles. They can also hide away in those. And so I think, whereas this kind of complete opposite today, where all these new threats, this pollution, this overexploitation, this removal of water, they're all centered on rivers. So instead of rivers being a safe space, rivers and sort of inland coastal areas, the other place you get some croc species, are in fact the most impacted. Um, and I think it's going to be, the question is, are crocs going to be able to survive current levels of impact before hopefully we start to recover some of these systems? If you think about the wetlands in the UK, obviously no crocodiles, but so many of them historically have been drained, and only now are people starting to restore and rewild these in the UK. If it takes this kind of that long to start restoring wetlands in other parts of the world, then it's challenging to know how crocs will cope. But a lot of species are pretty resilient. The fact the Chinese alligator isn't extinct is the most mind-boggling thing ever, because it lives in the most impacted hyper-agricultural areas of China, and yet they're still there. Just a few, but just in the edges of fields and duck ponds, just on the edge. And I think that if the species just hold on, then there's the potential to kind of reintroduce them to certain areas in the future. And I think that there's a lot of history surrounding crocodiles. A lot of cultures have stories, cultural importance, folklore surrounding crocodilians. And so a lot of people want to conserve crocodiles and are interested in them, which is a huge asset for people who want to conserve them for perhaps more ecological reasons.
So yeah, that actually ties into the last question I wanted to ask, which is, aside from the ecological roles identified as a key aspect of crocodilians to conserve, why do you think conservation of crocodilians is so important outside of the ecological sort of purview?
Yeah, so I just love them. I think they're really, really fascinating. And I've always, sort of growing up as a child, thinking about those species which have gone extinct because of human activities always made me really sad and angry as a sort of 8, 9, 10-year-old, being like, I really wanted to see the baiji, the Yangtze river dolphin, but it had just gone extinct. And similarly, these kind of other species like the thylacine that people continue to have this massive interest in. And I think that if we lost crocodile species, we are losing something that is just, on the one level, just fascinating, and on the second level, losing this kind of associated culture and folklore. And for some people, certain crocodiles are a totemic animal. For other people, there's a lot of belief that the crocodile is our ancestor. In other places, it's simply just the focus of folklore and other types of storytelling. And work on other species has shown how a lot of these beliefs and understandings and things that are really important for understanding our own cultural and personal histories as humans, which is of course vitally important, are tied into sort of certain species. And so I think if we lose crocodiles, we lose their ecological role, but we also lose the cultural role they have as well. And I think that would just be really sad.
Yeah, indeed. I think they're one of the animals that probably inspire kids a lot. I don't know if they lose that as they grow, and they prefer the cuddliness of other animals or whatever. But I think just their power, they're very animate and strong and big and large. It's sort of symbolic, sort of a touchstone, isn't it? If they were to go, I feel it would be a loss that would be felt very strongly. But
absolutely. And I think it's also, there's certain species we'll probably never lose. They're really secure: saltwater crocodile, American alligator, Nile crocodile. But some of these more unusual species are the ones that are at risk. And so it would be a real shame if we're only left with kind of one type of crocodile rather than the kind of diversity we have.
Indeed. Well, there's hope. There's still hope yet,
there is,
as you have clearly showed. So that's wonderful news. So just to wrap up, is there anything you'd like to say? Any thanks you'd like to give to anyone, collaborators, contributors, and just any sort of take-home message you'd like our listeners to come away with?
love to say a huge thank you to everyone who discussed this paper with me. There were dozens and dozens of people who put up with endless emails about what they'd seen in their field site or whether they'd ever seen a certain croc species wandering through the forest. So huge thanks to everyone who answered my endless questions. Yeah, and as kind of a thing to leave on, I would really encourage everyone to go and find out more about some of these weird species of crocodile. Um, and if you can, to support efforts going on to save them. There's some really incredible research and conservation work going on by people who are conserving some of these more unusual crocodiles in their home countries. And so finding out about what they're doing and supporting them is, I think, one of the best ways we can try and conserve croc diversity today.
Wonderful, thank you. So a link to the paper will be available in the description of this podcast. As I said, it's due to come out as well as part of a special focus on animal functional traits that will be out in a few months' time. I'd just like to really thank Phoebe for the time that you've given us for this podcast. It's been fascinating, and really do hope you'll keep flying the flag for your gharials, and that we'll have lots more positive things to talk about in the future.
Thank you so much for inviting me on and letting me witter about crocodiles.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.